Bienvenido Ben Nelson. Welcome, Ben Nelson.
What if the hardest thing for us as a society to change about what we know isn't what we all know to be true, but what we accept to be as it has to be? My great-grandfather was born in a world where the idea of washing your hands was a heretical concept, where knowledge of germs did not exist. My grandfather was born into a world where the vast majority of the human population served as subjects to individuals that most believed were chosen by God to rule them. My parents were born into a world where it was accepted practice by the vast majority of humanity to judge another person based on their religious, ethnic, or national background. They were born into worlds that accepted status quos as they were. And that acceptance led to misery and death. Today, we feel like we know so much more. We feel like we have the ability to distinguish between what is and what should be. But are we really that much different than those who came before us? How do we find out what it is that we know? What do we believe is the pathway of acquiring real knowledge? Do we actually have a different method of educating ourselves than those generations that came before us? Those generations that believed in judging people by their background as opposed to their person. By those generations that believed in serving a divine monarch as opposed to participating in governance as a free person. As those generations that believed in bad humors and miasma as opposed to germs and hygiene. Because in our generation and in all other previous generations that we know of, we've looked at education as a thing to attain, as knowledge to be consumed, recalled, and repeated. Today, when we think about the concept of education, we think about it as we have for generations, as something linear. You know something or you don't know something. You have a 93 out of 100 or you have an 87 out of 100. You have competency or you don't have competency. You demonstrate mastery or you don't demonstrate mastery. But the world is simply not binary. The reality is that real education isn't linear. All of the things that we enjoy today in society, all of the advances that we've made collectively as humans, none of that came from recalling information taught to us by previous generations. It came from being able to take general ideas and concepts and being able to apply them in new and novel contexts. Finding a problem that we've not encountered before, individually or collectively, and relying on our ability to analyze that situation and apply learnings from radically different situations to solve those particular problems. That's otherwise known as wisdom. It's wisdom, the broad application of knowledge, the ability to know what to do in a situation you've never encountered before, that's the ultimate goal and value of education. It is the ability to look at an issue using first principles and reject the status quo as it is, but instead think about how it should be. And how does education do that today? Because when we think about our entire educational careers, when we think about our time in primary or secondary school, certainly in higher education, how did we learn? What did we learn? We sat in a class, sometimes when we attended. We were largely lectured to. We had a final exam. We spent a week reading all the things we should have read during the entire semester. We passed the test, and then we immediately forgot everything that was on the test because we didn't need the information. And we did that over and over and over again. And if any of you doubt that, just imagine that under each of your chairs is one of those final exams from college. And imagine you had to take it right now. Would anybody here not flunk that exam? Assuming you didn't take it last week. The reality is, we didn't learn nearly as much as we needed to during our education. And in fact, even if we did, even if we could recall that information, how often would we use it to solve the day-to-day challenges that we face? How many times at your workplace do you say to yourself, oh, I studied that in college. I know what to do. How many times when you go and vote, do you say, oh, thank goodness for that particular class that helped me decide how I feel about this particular social issue? How many times when you yourself educate your children, do you think back to the lessons that you learned in a formal educational environment? But that isn't to make the argument that formal education is not necessary. Quite the opposite. It's to have you think about what a world would look like where formal education wasn't focused on the linear assessment of short-term recall, but instead, if it was constructed to give you those tools, to enable you to solve the problems in your personal life, your professional life, your life as a citizen and participant in the human experiment? And what if an education wasn't structured in particular silos, wasn't structured in such a way where a professor would teach you a point of view and assume that that point of view is reality or knowledge or the truth? But instead, if every component of your education, what you learn in your formal class environment, what you then repeat with other mentors and teachers and professors, what you apply in your day-to-day world, getting feedback from those around you, all was part of a whole to demonstrate that the same concepts, the same ideas that help you in one facet of your life apply to another. What would happen if my great-grandfather was able to be born into a world where people understood the difference between a fact and a claim? They would understand that the emerging research at the time around washing your hands reduced maternal death by a factor of 18. What would happen if my grandfather was born into a world where people could distinguish between a fact and a claim, and were able to think about why it is that different gods in different parts of the world chose particular individuals to rule them? What would the world have been like if my parents were born into one where racist and classist ideology didn't degenerate the world into war and the Holocaust? And yet people will say, well, we've come so far. We now know those things not to be true. Yet do we? Think about the last couple of years and how experts, medical and scientific, provided definitive solutions and answers that turned out to be definitively wrong a few weeks later. Think about the past few years and the retreat of self-representation around the world and the bending down to populism and autocracy. Think about even in the halls of some of our most respected educational institutions, where the study of eugenics, under a very different name, is now back in fashion. When we focus our educational system on telling truths, on telling knowledge in and of itself, without the tools that enable human beings to systematically assess that knowledge, we leave ourselves prone to that type of regression that we're seeing. 10 years ago this month, I announced to the world that Minerva exists, that our job, by starting first our own institution of higher education, but then enabling other institutions to come along that journey themselves was to nurture critical wisdom for the sake of the world. But Minerva is not just this extraordinary institution. It is not just a collection of other institutions that deeply care about systematic thinking as opposed to opinion, that care about contextualizing learning as opposed to providing absolutes. But it's a movement. It's a movement that understands that we have to shift our understanding of education such that future generations will not only look back and see historical patterns repeat themselves, but will understand how this new kind of wisdom-centered education finally broke that cycle. We hope that you will all join us in this movement. Thank you.